Thank you very much. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Martin School of Public Policy Administration and the Department of Political Science here at the university, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to this spring seminar on public policy issues of great interest to the state and nation. This particular seminar follows our fall seminar dealing with voting rights, which is a celebration of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was well attended. We really appreciated your participation there as well. This afternoon we'll be considering a topic which of great interest nationwide. Given the national interest in public and political polling that's given rise from the national election, there are a number of issues have arisen regarding the political polling process. So we've titled this afternoon's discussion, Political Polling in Transition. Political polling, of course, has become a major part of this election process. We've heard many polls being released almost on a daily or weekly basis, some of those in conflict, some of those actually accurate, and some of those actually have had errors. So there are a number of issues regarding political polling which we think are worthy of conversation. Among the issues that we might discuss this afternoon by our panel would include the use of polling as political candidates lay out their political platforms. They also use polling to identify their progress in campaigns and might also consider changes in their political strategies as a result of political polling. But certainly to the degree that they're greatly accurate or there are inaccuracies that can lead to misleading strategies and other issues during the campaign process. So this afternoon, again, I'd like to welcome you, and I'm confident you're going to enjoy a very outstanding panel that we've been able to attract this afternoon. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this afternoon's program. Michael Ruling is a member of the Martin School's Board of Visitors, and he's played a major role in putting together this afternoon's panel and the program this afternoon. I would also like to especially recognize the members of the Martin School's Board of Visitors. I know we have several individuals here. We have Ron Carson, if you would stand please. Kurt Llewellyn, a new member for our Board of Visitors. Pam Miller, Brad Cowgill, Mike Ruling, Linda Breathitt, Dan Sprague, and Bob Wiseman. I hope I've caught everybody, but this is an outstanding group. And their value to the Martin School is just hard to explain. They've just done many different things to enhance the status of the Martin School, increase the knowledge about the Martin School in our community, and they've been helpful in almost every way that we've asked them to assist us in the Martin School. I'd also like to introduce Representative Phil Moffitt from Louisville, who is here with us this afternoon. As indicated, our moderator this afternoon is Michael Ruling. Michael Ruling has had a rich involvement in public policy and issues dealing with public polling. For example, more recently he was serving as the former vice president for federal legislation for the CSX Corporation, and he headed the Washington, D.C. office for CSX. Prior to that, he had various other positions with CSX Railroad and Transportation, and was a former staff member for staff of former U.S. Senator Wendell Ford. He carried out various activities in that role, and he had an interesting and very special role. In 1990 and 88-89, he served as executive director of the Congressional Joint Committee on Inaugural Activities and Ceremonies. So it had to be a very special experience, Michael, and we'd like to maybe hear about that sometime. By the way, he has also secured our speaker for this fall. We're an organization that thinks ahead. On October 13th, we'll hold the second annual Wendell Ford lecture, and we're going to hold the name of that person, but I think you'll be really pleased to be able to attend that event on October 13th. So that's something we hold in the fall semester. Finally, I'm going to take a little time for a commercial. I know that there are students here who are thinking about their careers and their future activities. Martin School is a great place for you, and as a matter of fact, we have some materials at the back of the room. We just in case you'd like more information about the potential opportunities in the Martin School as a graduate student, both for your master's degree or for a PhD. And given the fact the work we put in, I thought it was worthwhile actually having a commercial to take advantage of such a beautiful crowd this afternoon. I would now like to turn the program over to our moderator, Michael Ruling. And again, I want to thank him for his very hard work on this program. And I think you'll find it to be a very great and interesting program this afternoon.
Thanks, Merle. Wow, is it great to see such a crowd here today. Thank you so much for coming. On behalf of the Martin School, which is one of the outstanding public policy graduate programs in the country, and of course the outstanding UK Department of Political Science, welcome. We think this is going to be a very enjoyable and informative afternoon. And let me tell you something, I spent most of my life in Washington, D.C., so the idea of having posters, come to a class or come to an event is fairly routine up there. But this is something that doesn't happen every day in Lexington, Kentucky, and at the University of Kentucky campus. We have at this table on my left two of the nation's top political pollsters and strategists. These are the people who are behind the scenes of the campaigns that you read and hear about in the papers and in the media and on the news. These are the people that really know what's going on, and to have them here is an experience that is, probably routine if you go to Georgetown or George Mason or American or any of those schools in the DC area, but this is a big deal here. And I'm really glad to see so many of you take time to come and hear these folks, because I know you're going to go away understanding more about this crazy political process that's going on now, and you're going to have some insights that you otherwise would not have, given the fact that these folks here, they are the ultimate insiders. So this is going to be quite an experience. Our featured presenters are both well known in the Washington world. On my direct left is Robert Blizzard, who's a partner in public opinion strategies. Next to him is Celinda Ross, who's the president and founder of Lake Research. What did I say? Celinda Lake, sorry.
That's okay.
I don't even know a Celinda Ross. I must have made that up.
I figure my ancestors were sitting by the side of the lake and said, "Oh, let's call ourselves Lake," so it's okay.
Sorry about that. That's a good start.
No, that was fun. That was fun.
I'll look at my notes a little closer from now on. But they're here today to talk about the hows and whys of political polling, how it's done, how it's been impacted by the advent of new technology and social media, why projections and predictions are usually right, but not always, as evidenced by the public polling results in the last two statewide elections in Kentucky. In addition, we look forward to hearing their perspectives on current issues and trends, the mood of the country, and how they see this presidential primary process rolling out between now and the conventions, and then how they see the elections playing out after the conventions until November. Our first speaker today is Dr. Stephen Voss, and he's the one on the far left. Maybe that's where I got the Ross. Voss. Anyway, Professor Voss is a specialist in elections and voting behavior, and he's going to frame the subject for today's discussion with a general overview of polling, the role it plays in campaigns and elections, and the challenges facing pollsters as they adapt to all the new changing technologies out there. Professor Voss will be followed first by Mr. Blizzard and then Ms. Lake. Upon the conclusion of their presentations, we're going to have a roundtable discussion to follow up on some of the things they said and explore in more detail the events that are leading up to the 2016 elections. So let's get started. Professor Voss, it's all yours.
If you're asking yourself, what am I doing on a panel with two such esteemed guests, you're not alone. That's where I started. And in asking what I should do here is asking why I was here. And the title of my portion of the talk doesn't tell you why I'm here, it tells you why I'm not here. It says, I dropped my crystal ball in the 3rd year on the job, which was a line I told to Bill Goodman on Kentucky Educational Television after I went on there, and he kept asking me for predictions. I don't have a crystal ball, and my comments on elections in Kentucky kind of prove it. So, for example, in that same KT show, when he asked me to go out on a limb and said, who's going to win the Republican caucus, Professor Voss said, right here, with no other information, I'll say Cruz. A month later, Donald Trump won by more than 5 percentage points. Or forget about 2016, how about 2014? I don't understand why people looking at the public information would think that Grimes has lost the race. I would not give you even odds on this race, I told the Washington Times. And Mitch McConnell trounced her about 2 weeks later by more than 15 percentage points. Or there's the governor's race in 2015. My favorite quote of all time. Except this one was a misquote. The race is Conway's to lose. Now, at this point, you might be asking yourself a few questions. One of them might be, then why don't you shut up and let these experts talk? And that's fair. And I hope to keep my comments brief, so we will get to hear more from them. Or if you're more generous in spirit, you may be thinking, well, they say you learn from your mistakes, and you're ready to write a 3-volume set. And that's also fair. And learning from mistakes, including mine, is why we're here. And my purpose is really less to give you answers and tell you things. I'm hoping that's what my fellow panelists will do. But mine is to try to ask the questions. Because having made those mistakes and having puzzled through many of these questions, I've got lots of questions myself. So what I'll be doing with the rest of my time is to help document briefly some of these mistakes, to put it in context. That was one of the first questions we asked in organizing this is, well, are the polls really getting it wrong? Is the premise false? But I'm going to tell you, no, it's not false. The polls are getting it wrong, the public ones. And then to try to quickly identify some challenging questions that I'm hoping our panelists will help us. If you're even more generous to a fault, you may have been thinking those quotes from Professor Voss cannot be right. There must have been more to what more to what he said than we're being told, and that's true too. And one of the other things I want to stress is that while even experts have a lot of questions, we generally have more answers than make it into the press coverage and that make it into the accompanying chatter around these polls. It's very hard to get that information to the public, but with this 90-minute forum, I'm hoping some of that can get through to the audience we have here today. So I realize that with these tables, well, for one thing, they're not the color they were on my other computers. I realize that if you're in the back, you may just have to listen to my words and not see the numbers, but at least for the folks who could see, I wanted to provide some concrete examples. To start laying out the mistakes and also start to bring out the questions, I have here the 2014 Senate poll results, the public polling results from Kentucky, where McConnell ran against Grimes. I know you can't read the whole table, so I'd like to bring to your attention just a couple of things. First, when I made that statement about I wouldn't give you even odds, that red box defines what the polls had been telling us about where the race stood. And what you'll notice is that Mitch McConnell was barely topping 50% in those polls, and given the large margin of error around those polls, if you were at least a cautious bettor, you really would not have been giving more than even odds or treating it as more than a coin toss, given the information available to the public. So one of the possibilities that we need to consider, you can see the polls, if you can see, the polls shift toward McConnell fairly late in the process. One possibility for why the polls are going wrong is that voters are changing or deciding very late in the process. And in particular, the large number of undecided voters could be breaking toward these winners very late in the process. Another thing to point out is that when you actually look at the Real Clear Politics average, in other words, their numbers representing the most recent polls, in fact, the two-party difference, the difference between McConnell and Grimes, was only 4 percentage points away from what Real Clear Politics was saying. So although it was played up as this massive failure of the polls, the public polls really weren't, the late ones really weren't as far off as you might have gotten the impression. Now, moving to 2015, when I allegedly made that fateful statement that the race was Conway's to win. Some other interesting results show up that partly explain what I was trying to get across, but didn't make it into that article, which is, people point out there's large margins of error, they don't talk to that many people, maybe you can't really trust these polls, but that's only true of one poll. And once you've had a whole series of what are supposed to be scientifically taken unbiased polls, if they really are scientifically taken unbiased polls, once you've talked to this many thousands of people, the margin of error on the overall result, the combined results of all those polls, should be very small indeed. And that's what I was trying to get across in my quotes to the media, was that at this point, there's no way Conway's losing and the polls are just getting unlucky. Either these voters would have to shift late in the process, or there's something systematically wrong with the polls. And the latter is what I think is true, that there was something systematically wrong with these polls. They kept saying Conway, 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 with a total of 4,700 people consulted from 5 different organizations using different methods. So there's another part of the puzzle. It can't be anything too specific to Survey USA or the Bluegrass poll or any one thing if we're getting these consistent results across so many different methodologies and so many different pollsters. It's got to be something more fundamental. And also want you to notice how tight these numbers were. This is not a lot of error. This is not a lot of variation. Those polls were being very consistent, and again, unless they were doing something wrong, we should have been able to be very confident by this point in the results that we were hearing. You had to have bias. You had to have something systematically wrong to have the numbers be that tight and yet off. All right, so that points to the difficulty of educating the public already. Just those sentences I told you for that one slide, which I made, maybe 5 points across those 2 slides. I can't get that into a news story. I can get it into, a Kenny and Company one-on-one on ABC. I can get that into a 30-minute one-on-one section with Bill Goodman on KET. I cannot get it into 1 or 2 quotes in a Washington Times article. I cannot get it into, some of those other, the Reuters story, wire service story. I wasn't telling the Reuters person that it was Conway's to lose, and I have evidence because we know what I was saying right before and right after the interview, which is based on the polling methodology, Conway's ahead, but there may be systematic flaws. And I also told him, and I think there are. As you take more polls, the margin of error narrows. So the only way Matt Bevin wins this is either if there's a shift at the last minute or something wrong with these polls. So let's keep digging in at that. What might be wrong with these polls? Now, I could have used caucus and primary results from this year, but those have been fairly well covered, so I decided against doing that. As you know, Hillary Clinton's vote has not been as high as the polls have shown in quite a few contests, and Sanders has done better. Cruz upset Trump in the Iowa caucus, and there have been a couple of other ones in the Republican race that have been surprises. I thought it would be better to go back to those Senate races that were happening at the time McConnell trounced Grimes, despite polls that showed them fairly close. And the point I wanted to make here is that the error in Kentucky, far from this being about Kentucky, was smaller than the error in a whole series of other Senate polls taken in that same year. So when you're looking for an explanation, it's got to be something other than what they were doing in Kentucky or what Kentucky voters are doing. And the bias was more than 2% toward the Democrats, against Republicans. So and here's a question, is this because conservatives aren't being polled? The methodology is missing people who favor Republicans? Not so fast. Here are the results for 2010 and 2012. The polls were just as systematically skewed, just as off, but not toward the Republicans. In 2010, all 5 of the biggest polling errors showed the Democrats doing worse than they did. They were biased in favor of the Republicans. And 4 of the 5 worst polls in 2012 also showed the Democrats doing worse, the Republicans doing better. So the explanation also can't just be about conservatives and the GOP, because these swings in the polling sometimes favor one party, sometimes favor the other. So, okay, finally, what are these systematic explanations? What are some of the things people talk about that could be going wrong? It's not that we don't have ideas. The problem is we have too many. They can't all be going on. So my challenge to the 2 panelists is along the way, I hope that they'll address some of these common stories. Some I've mentioned. and some I have not. One is we have to figure out who will vote. Usually you can trust people if they say I'm going to vote for a Democrat or I'm going to vote for a Republican. But you can't trust them at all when they say, yes, I'm voting. So one possibility is that these adjustments that are made to guess who's voting might be messing up these polls systematically. It could be people are deciding late. I already brought that one out. It could be that the undecideds at the end flop strongly one way or the next. I don't think that's it, but we have people with better information, and we'll see what they have to say on that. It could be how we're picking people, the way we're sampling them. Cell phones, for example, have caused a lot of difficulty with polling. And people who have different jobs or work habits, and therefore you can't reach them in predictable times, can be taking some of, especially Trump and Sanders style supporters, out of the sample and skewing the results. And finally, there is the possibility of response bias, that who answers and who does not answer creates a bias. Are conservatives not cooperating, a sort of outgrowth of their distrust of institutions? Is that what's been wrong in Kentucky lately? Or is it more generally a cynicism, whether on the Sanders side or the Trump side, they don't trust these people they don't know calling them when they can see their phone IDs and they don't want to talk to them, and they pull themselves out of the sample. So those are my sort of setup challenges for you that we hope you can help answer.
Thank you.
Great job, Dr. Voss. Our first presenter, who has gets first shot at those questions that you raised, is Robert Blizzard. Robert is a rising star in Republican political circles. He's a partner at Public Opinion Strategies, a political and public affairs research firm that the New York Times described as, quote, the leading Republican polling company in the country. He's been involved in hundreds of campaigns across the country at the federal, state, and local levels. One of his clients is the congressman from here in the 6th District, Andy Barr of Lexington. Another one of his clients is Congressman Brett Guthrie of Bowling Green, who represents the 2nd Congressional District of Kentucky. He also polled and conducted focus groups for several independent campaigns on behalf of numerous U.S. Senate candidates, and one of those was Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican Majority Leader from Kentucky. Robert's firm also is part of the bipartisan team that does the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that you read and hear about almost every week. He's a graduate of Clemson University. Please welcome Robert Blizzard.
You guys hear me okay in the back? I like to walk around and show the slides that way. Thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to be here. What I want to do is we have about 15 minutes right before we move over. I want to take about 15, maybe a few minutes more than that. I want to walk through some of the challenges that Dr. Voss brought up in terms of polling. But then I want to transition a little bit and go through kind of the national political environment. What's going on out there, looking at the presidential race, because I think that's also something that you guys might be really interested in taking a look at. But let's start off with the polling itself. We only have 15 minutes. As Dr. Voss said, you can only get so much in at one time. Kentucky is not the only state, let me put it that way, that has had problems with public polling across the country. There are so many, and Celinda knows this too, now pollsters out there, or claim to be pollsters, that are doing survey research, and some are significantly better than others. There's just no doubt about that. The problem for Kentucky, the last 2 election cycles, is the Survey USA, that Bluegrass poll, has just been wildly inaccurate. And even a Western Kentucky, not to attack Western Kentucky, but a Western Kentucky poll last cycle in 15 in the governor's race was also pretty inaccurate. So what I want to do is I want to walk through those numbers a little bit, but I also want to do something kind of secretive here. I hope none of my clients find out. I want to show you guys some of our internal polling at POS during the same time. Not saying that we're the best in the world, but I want to show you comparatively how we were seeing the numbers compared to where, at least in close proximity, where the public polls were, so you kind of get a sense of why I think, at least, the public polling has been so really atrocious for the last few election cycles. Reason number one, what we do, and I'm assuming Celinda does the same, we use a voter list to poll from. It's very easy to do. You can get a list of voters across the state. You can get a list of voters across congressional district, by a state house district, by a judicial court, race. It's easy to get a list of registered voters. Registered voters are probably more likely to vote than people who aren't registered, right? However, the public polling the last few cycles has not been using lists of registered voters. They have been randomly calling all adults across the state of Kentucky and asking them, kind of what Dr. Voss alluded to, really what is a likely voter screener. How likely would you say you are to vote in the election? Well, number one, you have no idea if that person is a registered voter or not. And number two, as I show up here, we have found that likely voter screens are just completely inaccurate. You go back to the 2013 Virginia governor's race, which I'll use as a case study, although we tested this significantly in other races. When you have a list of registered voters, what you do is you ask them in the beginning of the poll, how likely would you say you are to vote in the upcoming election? Would you say that you're very likely, somewhat likely, not very likely, or not at all likely? What we did in Virginia a couple years ago is then we went back and we looked at, months later, okay, who actually voted in the election, and we could compare their answer on this question compared to whether or not they actually voted. Well, if you look at our poll, 79% of those who took part in our poll said that they were very likely to vote. 11% said they were somewhat likely, 4% said not very likely, and 6% said they're not at all likely to vote. We then went back again, looked at who actually voted. You had 33% of people who would have screened out saying they're not at all likely to vote, who actually voted on election day. Meaning if you had done a voter screener and screened those people out, you're essentially eliminating people who actually go out and vote. Conversely, and I think this is actually even a bigger finding, among the people who said that they're very likely to vote, only 58% actually voted. You had almost half who didn't even go to the polls and vote. So when you have public polls relying on surveys of adults and then screening down, you're getting very inaccurate data because they're not capturing who actually is going to go vote. And all of the studies and research that we've done, and I'm sure you guys have done too, shows that the best way to predict future behavior is to look at previous voting behavior. And you see that especially in the primaries. Secondly, this one just bugs me as a pollster because Kentucky is not that difficult of a state to poll in. There are much more difficult states to poll in, and especially for the Democrats who have even more diversity in their primaries and things, it's a much tougher audience. Kentucky is a pretty overall white state, about 85 to 88% white. And number two is with pretty good certainty what the partisan registration makeup of those who vote is going to be. I mean, if you go back, you can go to Allison Grimes' website, Secretary of State's website, and you can look at every election and the registration of voters versus actual turnout. And you can see right here that they're not really all that different. But as I'll go through in a second, when you look at the public polls, they have party numbers that are all over the place because they're not actually asking registration, they're asking ID, and again, there's no way to really know what that's tied back to. So again, from somebody who does it, this one's pretty frustrating. The third one, I want to try an experiment first. How many of you are registered to vote in Kentucky? Okay, let's say everybody. Okay. How many of you do not have a landline telephone number? Meaning you have a cell phone only household, basically. Keep your hands up. Okay, all of you people don't exist. You don't. In public polls, you do not exist. Because in the public polls, the Bluegrass poll, Western Kentucky did actually do some cell phone interviews, but most public polls can't afford to do cell phone interviewing. And in a state like Kentucky, you have anywhere between 35 to 45%, over a third of the state's population live in cell phone only households. If you're not polling those people, you are again completely missing out on a third of the electorate. And who the hell knows what that third is going to actually look like? Are they Republican? Are they Democrat? It varies state to state. It varies by age group. people say, oh, it's just young people. I mean, I know my in-laws and my parents are moving to cell phone only. I mean, there's a few gray hairs in the room that I saw say they're cell phone only. So, I mean, again, you're throwing out a lot of different people. It's not just the young people that people say you would be throwing out. And I say all that because the way that the public polls, especially the Bluegrass survey, got away from doing cell phones is they say, oh, well, they're just young people. We'll conduct those cell phone interviews online. That's the way we'll do it. And it's not, again, I'm talking about Bluegrass, the poll, because we're in Kentucky, but there are a lot of pollsters that do this. And again, here's a study that we did in the North Carolina U.S. Senate race. And we wanted to test this out because for us as pollsters, cell phone calling is getting expensive. And eventually we're going to have to find some other way of reaching people because it's becoming harder and harder for campaigns to be able to afford it. So we wanted to experiment with this. What we did here is in the week before,